Hello and welcome to marketing91.com. WTO was established on 1st January 1995 during Uruguay round of GATT, which is the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff Negotiations. It aims to further liberalize international trade. It is a legal and institutional body for the multilateral trading system among member countries. It aims to protect the global trading system internationally. Objectives of WTO are: trade without discrimination, ensure growth and development, optimum resource utilization, generate full employment, protect and preserve environment, raise standard of living and settle disputes. Features of WTO are: it is a legal entity, automatic mechanism to settle disputes, provides binding and permanent agreements, members enjoy equal rights, wide coverage, focus on trade-related aspects, and concentrates on intellectual issues. Roles of WTO are: foundation of multilateral trade, solve trade-related problems, serve as a permanent organization, protect global trading system, provide settlement procedures, established world trade negotiations, eliminates trade barriers, protects domestic industries, encourage foreign direct investment, and provide equal rights. Moving on, let's understand some of the important WTO agreements. The first is the General Agreement on Trade in Services, or GATS. It is the first multilateral agreement on trade in services. It aims to liberalize trade in all services. All member nations are bound to open their services sector to domestic and foreign private competition. Agreement on manufactured goods. Developed countries agreed to reduce tariff on manufactured goods other than textiles by 40%. Tariffs were reduced from 6.3% to 3.8% on average. Agreement on agriculture aims to increase market orientation in agriculture in member nations. Tariffs resulting from such transformation and other tariffs on agricultural products were reduced by 36% on average over 6 years for developed countries and by 24% over 10 years for developing countries. Agreement on textiles and clothing, multi-fiber arrangement. The multi-fiber arrangement, or MFA, is in force since 1973. In the Uruguay round, it was agreed that import quotas on textiles and clothing under the MFA would be phased out over 10 years by 1st January 2005. Agreement on TRIPs, or Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights. Intellectual property rights, or IRPs, are used to protect the interest of investors and developers of products and processes from being copied by others. The main features of the TRIPs agreement are: minimum protection standards to be provided by each member. Domestic procedures must exist for all member nations to enforce IPRs. Dispute settlement between WTO members. Dispute settlement. The WTO includes a dispute settlement body. Disputes arising out of trade and related matters must be settled within 18 months. Agreement on TRIMs, or Trade-Related Investment Measures, introduces measures to be adopted by member countries to treat foreign investments on par with domestic investments and to remove quantitative restrictions on imports. Foreign investment measures are identified as: obligation on foreign investors to use local inputs, obtain imports in lieu of producing for exports, balance foreign exchange payments for imports with foreign exchange earnings through exports, not to export more than a specified proportion of local production. Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, or SCM. Government subsidies to domestic producers reduce production costs, enabling them to sell products at low prices in the international market. This affords an average over other producers who do not receive as many national government subsidies. Subsidies given by the government to non-agricultural goods are classified as follows. Red, the WTO prohibits subsidies that have high trade distorting effects. Examples: subsidies on exports and subsidies that favor use of domestic goods over imported goods. Green, subsidies that are not specific to an enterprise or industry are not actionable under the WTO. However, underdeveloped countries have not abided by this. And amber, actionable by trading partners if their interests are adversely affected. The affected country can appeal to the dispute settlement body and go for countervailing measures. Now let's take a look at the impact of WTO on the Indian economy. The favorable impacts include increase in export earnings, agricultural exports, export of textiles and clothing, multilateral rules and disciplines. The unfavorable impacts include TRIPs in pharmaceutical sector, agriculture, microorganisms, TRIMs, GATS, trade and non-tariff barriers or NTBS, LDC exports. Contentious issues between developed and developing countries are those that do not agree to specific agreements with specific obligations. Contentious issues among member countries may include trade and investment, competition policy, transparency in government's procurement, trade facilitation, trade and labor standards, trade and environment, and e-commerce. The first contentious issue is environment. The WTO has no specific agreements pertaining to the environment despite the increased emphasis on provisions for environmental policies. At the end of the Uruguay round in 1994, trade ministers from participating countries decided environmental and sustainable development issues and created the Trade and Environment Committee to begin a comprehensive work program on trade and environment in the WTO. Transparency. The WTO agreement on government procurement is plurilateral as only few member countries have signed so far. The Singapore Ministerial Conference set up a working group as a multilateral to include all WTO members to study the transparency in the government's procurement practices toward national policies. Labor standards. This issue relates to core labor standards, that is, essential standards are applied to the way workers are treated. At the Singapore Conference in 1966, WTO members identified the International Labour Organization as a competent body for dealing with labor standards. Electronic commerce. This involves products crossing borders electronically. Examples: book, music, videos transmitted through the internet. The Second Ministerial Conference at Geneva in 1998 urged the WTO's General Council to examine all trade-related issues arising from global electronic commerce. Trade facilitations. The Singapore Ministerial Conference in 1966 instructed the WTO's Goods Council to start exploratory and analytical work on simplifying trade procedures to assess the scope for trade rules. The last topic in this video is on dispute settlement mechanism. Dispute settlement is the central pillar of a multilateral trading system. The WTO's dispute settlement mechanism uniquely contributes to the stability of the global economy. A dispute arises when one country adopts a trade policy measure or takes some action that one or more fellow WTO members consider to be in violation of WTO agreements or to be a failure to live up to the obligations. The dispute settlement body solely establishes panels of experts to consider the case and to accept or reject the panel's results of an appeal. Stages of dispute settlement are: consultation. Before taking any other actions, the countries in dispute have to talk to each other to see if they can settle their differences by themselves. Panel. When consultations fail, the complaining country can ask for a panel to be appointed within 6 months and within 3 months in an emergency. The main stages in the panel's work are as follows. Case in writing. Each side in the dispute presents its case in writing to the panel. First hearing. The complaining country, responding country, and other interested parties make their case at the first hearing of the panel. Rebuttals. The countries involved in the dispute submitting written rebuttals and present old arguments at the second meeting of the panel. Experts. The panel may consult experts or appoint an experts team to review to prepare an advisory. First draft. The panel submits the descriptive sections of its report to both sides and gives them 2 weeks to comment on its contents. Interim report. The panel submits an interim report with its findings and conclusions to both sides and gives them 1 week to ask for review. Review. The review period for both sides must not exceed 2 weeks. During this time, the panel may hold additional meetings with both sides. Final report. The panel's final report is submitted to both sides. After 3 weeks, it is circulated to all WTO members. This report becomes the dispute settlement body's ruling or recommendation within 60 days unless a consensus rejects it. Thank you.